48-hour art check, round 42. And here we are again, round 42.
I know we're facing off 42 times now, although there have been a few that have missed the intro animation.
Yes. We haven't missed it. We've just enacted it with our mouths and fingers.
That's true. So that means 42 times we've assaulted each other with art weapons.
Jeez.
All right, let's do this.
Okay, here we go. Who's going first? I think I'll go first.
Who's on first?
Yeah, right. We'll do that whole bit. So, since last we met, I finished that illustration of the girl taking a tea break. And I did a video on kind of the Borg collective groupthink mentality versus the lone wolf isolationist mentality and the problem with both of those things. And I designed the advertising for my con graphic that's going to go on their website.
Love it.
Thanks.
All right. I just pretty much finished inking this page. So what's being blocked by the timer right now is the one little corner that I haven't finished, and I definitely will finish that tonight. But this is a lot further than I expected to be. And I haven't even gotten today's work in, so this is much further than I expected to be, which I'm kind of excited about.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
That's awesome.
But that corner bothers me.
Right. As far as challenges go, I'm feeling a lot better. I'm just taking a ton of medicine now, and so that I'm not in any pain anymore. But it's just this endless cycle of feeding and diapers, and it's all bleeding together. Nothing really hard. It's just that slog of not producing art. I just need to make some stuff, as well as advertise some things. So nothing huge.
All right, here. So yesterday we have a swamp cooler, and yesterday the spout, so the way a swamp cooler usually connects is it usually connects to one of your hose outlets outside. Mm-hmm. And there's this little attachment that then has an out for the little tiny hose that goes to your swamp cooler. And that attachment, the stopper that prevents the main hose from going on while you have the water routing through the tinier hose, got blown out. So and it's 109 degrees outside.
Right.
So it was do we deal with just letting this leak when California is in a drought and this will be an insane water bill?
Yeah.
Or, so anyhow, I had to get a new part and do all that stuff, which is really not a big deal. It's just unscrewing one thing and kind of plugging it into the next. But for me, it's a lot because I'm not a handyman type.
Yeah.
So I was cool, I fixed it for $10, but that took a long time. And then there's the typical just struggle of we're crazy busy at my work, so I finally secured a freelancer to be in the house for a while, and so that should ease the burden a little bit in about a week, but it's just been crazy. And doing art on top of that's a challenge.
Yeah. We kind of glossed over plans. For plans, I've got to get the postcards printed, the stickers printed. No, the stickers I sent to the printer. I've got to finish designing the postcards and decide which sets I'm doing, and then the full-size poster prints as well. And I'm assuming you're going to finish this page and then
finish this page. Yeah, I'm going to finish this page, do scans and clean up and stuff, so that's probably what I'll do tomorrow. So I should at least probably have thumbnails for the next page, and this page should be posted on my site.
Cool.
Yeah. All right, so topic ideas. I had kind of a brief one, which was has now escaped my mind. Oh, great. I had it at the beginning, and now it's escaped my mind. The
written it down.
Oh yeah, I totally should have. Wow.
Well,
Okay. Well, now I'm kind of stumped for a topic idea.
What do you think
you have
about
anything?
Yeah, I just keep seeing all this happen with everything online, like this polarization. I'm wondering, how do you not stay neutral, but stay nuanced in an online environment where it's so polarizing, whether it's political or whether it's groups or whether it's whatever. Is that an interesting topic?
Yeah, I think it's really relevant to one of my biggest concerns, because I have a comic that it's pretty blunt. It's full of like a lot of language. It's pretty bluntly honest about kind of reality, about mental illness. And it's also going to deal with faith and like coming to faith and Christianity, but not in like a preachy, like, chick tract kind of way.
Right. Yeah.
And so that right there is a very polarizing thing to make, because for most publishers like that I've come across, like in the indie world, like, if you have a losing faith story, like that can be really potentially interesting. The gaining faith story, well, maybe they could go for like the whole evangelical market, but then the fact that it actually is honest and true, and depicts people, using language and like getting drunk and throwing up, and like has a pretty candid, showing of what mental illness is actually like, which isn't really pretty, and it also isn't going to paint the world as if it's like, everything turns around and becomes butterflies and stuff the second someone gets saved.
You're not going to see it on the Hallmark Channel.
Yeah, so that kind of negates it from that evangelical base. Right. And so it's like, by making this thing, it's like I've literally set out to make something that, because of polarization of the market, just in that, is going to be really a tough sell to like a publisher.
Yeah, and then along those same lines, and I'm not changing the subject because I think this adds to it, but along those same lines, I keep seeing groups of people, pick anything, whether it be politics or a specific industry or whatever. You keep seeing these groups of people polarizing with this, you're either with us or against us mentality. And that's kind of what I was doing that video on, and I'm still not sure. Like, I can see how both sides have really relevant points, and I agree with a lot of things that both sides are saying. I disagree with some of the things that both sides are saying, and it seems like in certain communities that you're in a position where you have to choose a side, but I don't belong in any camp. But I'm not one of those people that's like, I'm just staying out of it, I rise above the fray, or I'm Switzerland and the war isn't going on, or whatever. And so it's interesting because I'm kind of in a similar realm with my book. It's a children's book, and I've had the most recent literary agent that I talked to said that the art was sophisticated, and that I might need to, on my next book, simplify it. And so it's like, it's even like in an art style that doesn't fit in that genre or whatever as much as is normally expected. And so it's just an interesting thing. So what do you do in that environment where people are nuanced and groups of people are exceptionally polarized? Like, as an individual, I feel like I could talk to any individual and sit down and have a normal face-to-face conversation. But when you get a group of people together, that mob mentality changes things.
I'll qualify that by saying most people. Most people that you meet, you could have a one-on-one conversation with. Right. There is that occasional person that you sit down with and they're talking and you realize, like, oh, you're literally not on this planet. Like,
they're just spouting the mob mentality's talking points. And whatever,
or even behind that, just people who are like mentally deranged.
Oh, sure.
Where it's like, you're just like, oh, you're just not in touch with like what's like what's actually
right.
happening around you.
And that doesn't mean anyone that disagrees with me is mentally deranged. Because a lot of people say stuff like that, but you and I disagree on some very hot button issues.
Fundamental things,
and we're fine. And I'm like that with a lot of people. Like, there's a lot of people where I'm like, on this thing, you and I are like, whatever. But on the rest of it, I'm here, or, and that seems to be possible face to face. But here's what I guess I'm wondering. How do you do that with your art? We're producing things. Like my stickers, and the designs that I produce in my posters could potentially cost me publishing deals depending on the way people interpret them. I'm trying to break into the children's book industry at the same time as I'm doing editorial illustrations about narcotic abuse and voting registration, gerrymandering, and misogyny, and there's some pretty heavy issues.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things. I mean, like, for me, navigating it as an artist, I think at the end of the day, like, you need to be making things that are authentic to yourself, because otherwise you're going to be stuck in a loop of having to kind of create art for the tribe.
Right.
And I tend to think like tribalism doesn't make great things. I like having tribes sometimes, and I think it's very helpful. But I think, there's that whole old saying of like, a camel is a horse designed by committee, and I tend to think that tends to be what happens when you start letting the tribe or groupthink kind of dictate the content that you create. However, there's some current controversies that to me are super fascinating, but I don't think they're issues where it's one side thinks this and that's their point of view and the other side thinks this.
Right.
I think in some issues that are currently happening, there is definitely a side that is has a little more weight to their argument, and then there's another side, so I think some of it has to do with kind of stepping back and objectively looking at the issues that people are branching into tribes over. If it's a stylistic thing, once again, that's so based on just whatever the trend is at the time. So if I were really trying to get into indie comics, I'd do that kind of naive style. That's super popular. And by the time I finish my book, it'll probably be out the window in popularity, and then I'll just end up with this book that just followed. But wow, this is a good topic, because I don't know if we can.
So let me say this. Pikey Camp in the chat is saying tribalism grows from radicals, and I completely agree. And here's I guess what I'm trying to say. I'm currently finding it difficult because I have very strongly held political, religious, sociological, philosophical beliefs. And they're all nuanced. They're all gray. I think most people, if you honestly evaluate where you are, there's nuance in what you think. And
of course,
if your ideas haven't evolved since you were in high school, that's a problem. And I don't mean evolved to the left or to the right, but just at all. If you still think...
No, I agree, yeah.
The same... if I still thought the same things that I thought when I was 17 at 38, that's indicative of a different problem. My challenge here is there are some artists that in their online presence, they go out of their way to not step on any landmines. I don't talk about religion. I don't talk about politics. I just make art. That's it. There are other artists that, as a part of their online presence, they are very opinionated on all of those things, and thus alienate huge segments of people, but also niche down and attract others. Some people I think are doing that authentically. Some people I think are doing that because in either camp, it can be an easy way to gather fans in that niche. And so I guess I'm struggling to strike a balance between, I am interested in communicating general principles. I think kindness is important. I think, there's some general things that I always try to communicate and always try to talk on. But I seem to continue to kind of wander around in these topics where I'm just like, I'm holding back, not because I'm scared, but I'm holding back because I don't want my message to be co-opted by these radicals on either tribe of anything, And I feel that's also kind of like, I just got into Rick and Morty. I avoided Rick and Morty for a long time because I think a lot of the fans that are the really loud minority, right? Most of the people that like that show are probably normal people, and it's whatever, because it's a funny show. But like, some of them are dicks, and they're loud, and they do annoying things in public, and they go out and they haven't caught the point that it's a show that is mocking nihilism. Anyway, but I'm not willing to commit to a particular radical ideology so much so that it identifies me and drives everything that I do. And I find that stance is causing me to filter and hesitate as I go online, because I'm worried about being co-opted or being grouped in or whatever.
Yeah, and I can understand that. I mean, there's been some really interesting things just even doing like a YouTube channel where I've said things about like my political views, and in the comments section somebody will criticize me for having a view that I don't even have, because they're like, well, you're like, I definitely swing left on a lot of my views.
Sure.
So they just kind of assumed that I'm like on board with like everything the left believes. And to me, it's like, once again, it gets into that whole thing that you were just discussing about kind of like gray thinking as opposed to black and white thinking.
Right.
Like I tend to think, like when I was in junior high, philosophies that appealed to me were very much like, there's black and there's white, and you pick one and you pick the other. Like there's yes or no, and that's it. And there are a lot of issues that are way more complicated than that. And because they're complicated doesn't take away like the honesty behind them.
Right.
It's just that there are some issues that are much more complicated, and there's some thoughts that are nuanced. And I've gotten to an age where there's some things that are contentious that I have no idea what I think about. And I, like when I was younger, I would have had a 100% degree belief in like something on topics now that I'm like, I don't know,
Yeah.
So I think the key as an artist is to kind of like make art that's true to yourself and authentic, but also to not be a dick. So
Yeah.
Like I think regardless of your political viewpoint or your stance or whatever, I think that when you make art or when you make content or when you speak, I think that having a brief moment of considering what someone else might think based on what you were saying that's not a bad thing.
Right.
Do I think that we should be in a society that's like Big Brother looming over you and you're like, what's Big Brother going to think? No.
Right.
But do I think like if you're in a room full of, crowded room and you're talking, should you consider the audience? Yeah, for sure. You should, have a moment of kind of considering the audience and really measuring what you're saying, so that what you intend to say doesn't get co-opted. But there is that fear that, because you're right, like people have divided into tribes, and I think the internet's made it slightly easier to kind of find your tribe, which is kind of a cool thing for like identity. But I think that it's unfortunate because of the kind of strict tribalism that can happen. You can kind of you could say something that could be taken out of context by one of those tribes, like whether for ill or for their own gain or for like your loss or whatever it is that their goal is behind co-opting what you say. That's definitely an environment we live in. So I don't know what the answer to that is with content creation, other than the fact that I think that if what you're saying is considered and thought out, I think people are going to take you a lot more seriously than if you just fly off the cuff. Like I don't, man, this is such a good topic. Something I think about a lot. Like a perfect example to me of kind of like, because a lot of it's just sort of, a lot of it's miscommunication as well. Where like I have been the person who's had to have this conversation with multiple people when the whole Black Lives Matter movement started happening. And there were a couple people that I knew in my friend circle, and I knew they didn't intend it in a negative way, but they just kind of were like, well, all lives matter. And that was their instant reaction, was like an all lives matter thing. And I think, and then it would create this kind of issue with the person who maybe was posting that Black Lives Matter, like, okay, and create this big division. And usually in that case, there's just a misunderstanding of language. I've seen this happen too with like the word theory in religious circles. It's just like really misunderstood when it comes to science and religion. And as a believer myself, I've totally witnessed this like weird misunderstanding. But anyhow, so there's the whole point, at least initially from what I understand and what I've looked into with the Black Lives Matter movement, was the fact that like there were these people, and we're not going to get into like a case by case thing, but people were getting shot by police at an unusually high level, and a lot of them were kids. Right. And a lot of people in the Black community were kind of like trying to rise up and say like, hey, our lives should be valuable. Right. Like, our lives should be considered as valuable as anybody else's life. Black lives should matter. Just like all lives matter, Black lives should totally matter. That was the goal. So saying, and by the way, I'm not saying people need to agree with me on this. I'm just using it as an example of like where I think sometimes if you take yourself out of the narrative and kind of observe it and look at where people are coming from, you'll see these weird areas of miscommunication where it's just misunderstanding.
Yeah, and this is, so, I want to jump in because this is something that I find really fascinating, and I think is at the core of the problem. One is that all types of communication are inherently flawed and imperfect, right? Yeah. But there have been studies done where I can't remember the percentage off the top of my head, but I think it's like 70% of the meaning that we get in a conversation is from verbal cues. Yeah. And so it's the words that I say, the words that come out of my mouth, is 30% of what you'll understand. The rest of it is going to be body language. No, I'm sorry. It wasn't verbal cues. It was 30% words, 70% everything else. So that includes like voice inflection, intonation, facial expressions, body language. And the interesting thing is a lot of that can be misinterpreted really easily. You might think that I'm really disagreeing with you, but the sun could be in my eyes. You know what I mean? And I'm just squinting as you're talking, right? Because I'm like, the sun's in my eyes, right? And so that can be, but then worse than that is you take that to the internet and there's no back and forth. It's all asynchronous. So you don't have an instantaneous situation, and you strip everything but the words. So 70% of the intended meaning is now gone from an already flawed communication system. And so, because the Black Lives Matter, all lives matter thing, many of the people who are saying all lives matter, they're missing the point. But they actually might be trying to agree with the people who are saying Black Lives Matter, right? They might be trying to say I agree. Like everybody,
and once again, and once again, I think just like the issue on their end is that they're not really considering how that would come across. Like if you were like, dude, I just broke my leg, and it's like I were like, well, people break things, so what? You know, like that's kind of that almost sounds like you're trying to discount the fact that you broke your leg, which, like, regardless of how many people broke their legs, like that does suck if you broke your leg, right?
Yeah.
So like kind of changing the discussion kind of counters it's almost like an escape route from like having to actually kind of listen and sympathize. And so what I'm getting at though is like, I think you're right in the sense that I think a lot of the people who do the All Lives Matter feel that they have an interpretation of what the Black Lives Matter movement is trying to do that's incongruous with what they're actually trying to do. Right. And so it's like in response, there's like a defensiveness. So I think like there's a couple things like, by the way, my brother in the chat said he likes fiction and art because you can explore rather than preach. And I totally agree.
I actually really want to talk about that comment right after this.
Yeah. I mean, like, so, but I would say like just in a general interaction sense, like a really good thing to do is to kind of pause and just consider, have I fairly looked at what this person is trying to say that's offended me so much? Well, and I've seen this happen on college campuses a lot, and I'm sure you see it as a teacher, where it's like, you know, somebody will assert something and there's an instant like kind of defensive attack of a person who hasn't fully considered what's being said. And so it's like something that was said kind of triggers a thought or a personal kind of experience or something that someone had. And so they respond out of passion rather than kind of pausing and just kind of considering like, am I really trying to understand what this person is saying, or am I being defensive? So like, to me, a big warning sign for myself, at least, to try to go, am I being tribal here? Am I just like agreeing with the tribe? Is like, first, have I given this viewpoint a fair shake? Like, do I understand? Like Cory, when we talk, 80% of like, because we don't agree on everything, right? 80% of what I'll try to do is just kind of try to figure out where you're coming from,
right?
Because like, to me, I walk out of the room smarter if I've learned a little bit more about you and kind of why you believe certain things or why you think certain things. To me, that actually educates me more and also helps me and enlightens me, so that if I have a discussion with you where we disagree, it's like I'll actually know what I disagree with you on. Because like I might have this assumption just coming into a conversation with you that, oh, you believe this, therefore blah, 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 you know, and that's, I mean, like you were saying, people are nuanced, so that's often not the case.
And that's the other thing. Holly said, arguing nonstop on campuses is so tiring, not my favorite environment. And I completely agree. It's an environment where, I don't know, but I completely agree. I would much rather, when there's food involved and less people, it's a lot better. You know, like, if you're just sitting down and hanging out and having a burger, you know, or whatever, you know, going to get some frozen yogurt, I don't know. That's always better. But the other thing that is interesting is with this is that you bring all of your past experiences with you to every conversation that you have. Every word that you hear is loaded with all of these triggers that are underneath the surface. You might say something completely innocuous that has nothing to do with anything, and it will trigger a memory of some guy that beat me up when I was in school that used that word while he was doing it or something, and all of a sudden I will have a response that has nothing to do with your message, right? And I might maybe even recognize that on the surface. Beyond that, like, words can mean multiple things and phrases can mean, and so it's all this kind of weird thing. There's two comments I want to point to, and then I got to ask you before I do this. Do you want to go a little long tonight? Because I'm open. Do you have time, or do you want to get back to it?
I'm fired up. I can go a little bit longer.
Okay, let's do it.
Okay. I definitely want to touch on the fiction art exploring rather than preaching thing, because I think we both kind of wanted to hit on that.
Yeah,
real
for
quick.
sure. Because I think that's really, really important. Pikey Camp said right before that, be true to yourself without being full of yourself. And I don't know what Book of Boone is. So that's a reference I'm not familiar with. But I like that phrase a ton because my initial concern, one of my rules is that I want to be, and I hate that this word has become like a buzzword, but authentic, true to myself, like authentically me, right? You and I are both existentialists. And in an existential philosophy, like one of the most important things is to try to experience the moment as it's happening and be present and be real and be passionate and live life now instead of in the past or in the future and whatever. And part of that is what I am feeling and thinking and experiencing now is how I will behave and speak and act. But then the not being full of yourself is an interesting part of it, because that's the other thing that you said that I thought was really important. If we could just inject a little bit of empathy into all of these things, that is literally the solution to everything, right? Israel, Palestine, on huge scales, on small individual scales, Hatfield and McCoy's, whatever it is, Bob and Judy hate each other, I don't know, whoever. Like, if you can just take a moment to empathize with the other person and try to understand where they're coming from, not only will that humanize the situation, because I think that's a big problem, and I've talked about that a lot on my YouTube channel, is the dehumanizing of things, where if I'm driving down the street and somebody cuts me off, I can't be mad at them until I other them. So I have to make sure that I categorize them as something different than myself. They're an idiot. Up here in Idaho, you can tell what county people are from based on their license plate.
Yeah.
And there are specific counties that are known for not driving well, or whatever. But before I start getting pissed at them, and it happens in an instant, I have to make sure that I categorize them as something other than myself, because I can't get mad at myself, right? Self-harm is this reflex.
But it totally does work that way, where it's like the second you've cut someone off, you kind of rationalize it. Well, I've got my reasons.
Right.
But the second somebody cuts you off, it's like they have no reason. How dare they? Right. We're all just here on this road, just being great citizens, and you just broke the rules, buddy. That was intentional and personal.
And I bring this up in class. Yeah. You'll imagine what that person looks like, and then you'll be super pissed at that image that you have. And when you pass them, you look at them. And you look at them and watch how quickly your feelings change when you can identify with the person that you see. If they're different than if they look like your mom, or they're like a category of individual that you're very empathetic to, the elderly or something, and you look over and you go, oh, it's grandma, all of a sudden you're not pissed. The facticity of that situation, the events that happened have not changed in the slightest. But your perception of that person as somebody who is worthy of your forgiveness or not changes in an instant.
Yeah.
And so that's really interesting. Okay, so I wanted to get that out of the way. Okay, Greg.
No, I like that.
Go ahead.
I did want to touch on that. So the empathy thing that you were bringing up, though, does tie into the whole thing about art, because the best example that's kind of fresh on my mind is this documentary on Netflix, and I'm forgetting the name. But this woman who's a Muslim embedded herself with these really extreme white supremacist groups all throughout the U.S. And interviewed them and just kind of hung out with them and documented what they did and kind of interviewed them about like why they believe what they believe. And the weird thing is, throughout the documentary, they kind of become friends with her, the person who filmed the documentary. And so it just starts, and you can see just like this visible disturbance to their own kind of preconceived notions about like what a Muslim is, because they're being confronted with someone who's a Muslim, who's not like this nightmare who's out to kill them, but is like this really sweet lady who's really interested in knowing like all about their lives and stuff. And I think eventually, like, one of the guys, like, even leaves the organization, but most of them have this thread of story where they're like, well, I used to think this, but then I met you, and I've never met a Muslim. So, like, you know what I mean? So it was one of those things of, like, they had this preconceived notion, but really the issue was just that they hadn't really experienced diversity, and just were kind of raised in a culture that just kind of reinforced these kind of crazy beliefs.
Yeah.
And so, like, that documentary in itself is like a piece of art, but like a piece of art that causes empathy, and I think, you know, causes people to be able to step outside of themselves, and hopefully will speak to people kind of in those, like, hate communities and stuff too.
Yeah.
But it just seemed like an example of that. Or, like, the autobiography of Frederick Douglass is always a good example too. When that came out, so many people in America were, like, just blown away, and people who had kind of agreed with slavery and were just kind of on board with the propaganda read that book and were like, oh, wow, okay, this is a thinking, rational human being who has feelings. And like, it kind of countered the narrative of like lazy, like, at the time there was this narrative, a false narrative of, like, all African Americans were meant to be slaves and stuff like that, and a lot of, like, terrible propaganda that was kind of reinforcing some really bad beliefs. But just the existence of Frederick Douglass and the ability for him to think rationally, that he was a hard worker, that he was an educated man, and had kind of worked his way up, and it's this fluid, beautiful book that just sort of paints a portrait of, like, how horrific and terrible slavery is. And that really was like a culture shift. Now, they don't all have to be like biographies and stuff, but it's just like two that come to mind in my mind. And I think that can happen with fiction in even a more subtle, but maybe even more powerful way.
Yeah. So let's read Greg's comment. And he said that Sarah Silverman's show is doing that. And I've seen the previews for that, but I haven't seen the show. It looks really interesting. He said a while ago, I like fiction/art, because you can explore rather than preach. And it reminded me of the guy who wrote Invisible Ink and The Golden Theme. His name is escaping me now. McDonald, I believe. I've got it. Anyway, it'll come to me. His Twitter handle is bmcd55 or something. I can't remember what his name is though. Brian McDonald. That's what it is. Brian McDonald. And he points out a number of times that Rod Serling, the guy who did Twilight Zone, wrote all of this really, like, searing political things about society and how we're treating each other and all this stuff. And the censorship at the time was like, dude, you can't say this on TV. This makes people uncomfortable and you can't do it, you know? And he was like, well, like, it's important, right? And they're like, no, you can't have this on TV. It's not happening. We're not going to let it on TV. And so then what he did is he told those same stories, exact same messages, but he made them monsters and aliens and alternate dimensions, and he added, like, some sci-fi twist to it, and then all of a sudden it was just good fiction. And I don't know if the censors were just stupid, or if they're like, yeah, well, as long as it's one step removed. I don't know. I tend to think that they're probably stupid based on my feeling of censorship. But the idea is that society was okay with it and was able to accept it when you say the same message. And it lands, right? Because if you come out and there's a dude that looks exactly like me, and he is represented to think and act like me, and you paint him as the villain, I am immediately going to be like, no, you suck. I'm not the bad guy, right? But if I empathize with these characters, they're distant or other than me, and you see, like, Star Trek doing this, Star Wars does this, like, sci-fi and fantasy have been doing this for as long as those genres have existed. You know, I mean, you look at Alan Quartermain, right? H.G. Haggard, the guy who invented like the Lost World genre and Alan Quartermain and all that, She and all that. Like tons of people have based. I mean, Indiana Jones is basically based on that character. He wrote tons of stuff back in the day where he's got this like English gentleman. This is like hundreds of years ago, who goes and he prefers the Zulu of Africa to the English gentry because they're more honest. But because it was couched in this, this like, you know, adventuring kind of, you know, King Solomon's Mines and all this stuff, like, and this kind of Indiana Jones adventure, like, people loved it. But if it was like Pride and Prejudice style, where it was exactly like life, and he was like, you know what, white people, black people are way better than you are right now, and here's why, that guy would have been burned at the stake hundreds of years ago, right? And so there's been this idea, and I love that, and that's the thing that I'm trying to do is I've been trying to, because I'm going to this con, I've been trying to decide whether I want to explain what my work means to people, and I'm not going to. People are going to ask me, because I try to make thought-provoking things, right? And people are going to ask me, oh, what does this mean? And I'm just going to say, you know, I leave that up to people. I just put ideas together that juxtapose each other, and there is a message, but I leave the interpretation of that message up to the viewer. And I think that's going to really frustrate people, but that's what I'm doing with my art. Like, I'm not trying to tell people what to think. I'm trying to get them to think.
Yeah, and I think that's important because you're not going to be in front of everybody who buys a sticker in the future, you know? And so I think explaining is a mistake because you're not going to be next to, like, for instance, in the case of my book or your book, like, we're not going to be next to the reader.
Yeah.
You know, and everybody who reads it's not going to be like, oh, let's check out an interview with the author and find out what they intend. In fact,
he has hundreds of videos on YouTube espousing his beliefs. I'd love to listen to this.
Yeah. And from what I've noticed in interviews with a lot of authors, like, they get very frustrated because a lot of people will take out of their books things they had no intention of saying. So,
right.
But I do think Greg just touched on something too, which is he said he's not really talking about offering a message, but raising questions. And I think that's true too. And this kind of ties into like one of my overall, I think we're in agreement on this, Cory, but maybe I'm wrong. But I feel like one of the goals for me as an artist, like my own goal, is to try to depict truth. And that's a really hard thing to do. Like even in this book that I'm writing right now, one of my challenges, because I'm writing autobiography and it's all from my own perspective, is to try to kind of step outside of myself when I'm observing events that happened and go like, what was I really like? Because there's this weird, fascinating thing that happens as time progresses. My memory kind of makes myself better in the past than I was, or maybe even worse. But it's rarely true to what I was actually like at the time, or even emotionally where I was at the time, because I've created this narrative and time has passed.
Right.
So in order to be true to it, I have to like kind of step outside of myself, because I don't want to just write some book. Like, to me, I've talked about this multiple times, but it's like, to me, what's interesting in autobiography is when people get into the gritty, uncomfortable stuff. And that stuff doesn't really get into that beautiful kind of uncomfortable, not super black and white area until you really start getting honest. And getting honest is a weird thing, because like, at least for myself, when it comes to like autobio, because most of us are pretty narcissistic in our own viewpoint of ourselves. So like, it's been interesting to kind of look back and try to kind of like take away some of the sheen that I've put on events in my mind, like since they've happened, the little kind of
which I think is one of the main points about your comic that I love, is because everybody is the hero of their own story. But when you read quarterly stories right now, you do not necessarily come off as the hero, especially
I hope not
in the pages that you're doing right now. Now it's a character arc, right? But if if we do what we do on social media, where we think, that was kind of an embarrassing thing that I did. I was kind of a dick there, you know, or whatever. I don't think I'm going to post about that. And you did that in an autobio. That would be such a boring thing. I think it would lose a lot of the power, because one of the things about quarterly stories that I really like is that I can relate to that because it feels round. It doesn't feel like, one of the reasons that I really am bothered by Captain America and Superman, they're really boring to me. They're always good. They're never challenged. You know, and I know people have written them in different ways and whatever, but like, as a basic character, I have real difficulty relating to them. Now, I know they stand for ideals and things like that, and that's a whole different thing, but as a person, I can't relate to them as a person, right? Whereas the way that you're writing that, I find fascinating, because we've had similar experiences in dealing with depression and anxiety and spouses going through postpartum and all that type of thing. And if you were to be a fly on the wall in my house during that time, you wouldn't necessarily say, boy, Cory sure is handling that well.
Yeah.
You know, and I don't think anybody does. Like, you can handle it way worse, and you can handle it not as bad, but it's not like anybody goes through any of that and is like a shining example of humanity. And so that's something that I think is really important, and a key element of what you're saying and what you're writing and what you're producing right now, which is one of the reasons why I think it's gonna be a really powerful book, because it already is.
Thanks, man.
And I think what I think about that is that key, that flawed character. We've got a lot of people in the chats right now. Flawed characters are essential, is what Pikey Camp is saying. And for authenticity and that feeling of reality, that's very true. Yeah. Because every person that you know is not one way, right? They're all made up of so many different things and can handle. So
I think the interesting thing that ties into kind of Greg's comment that comes out of that, at least for me, is like when I'm writing that way, where I'm having to kind of step away from my own assumptions, even about myself or about other people, and you kind of have to step outside of it. It forces you to kind of deepen your writing. And I think in doing that, let's say you're writing a character that maybe you judged as a villain, like this is going to be my bad guy. Let's say it's a superhero comic or something, you know, and you know, you want to write it well because you understand like flawed characters are kind of the way it goes. And generally, unless you're doing a force of nature villain, you're going to need your villain to have a really compelling and kind of honestly almost convincing reason for doing the evil that they're doing.
Right.
And so now you're going to like create this villain and have to kind of put yourself in the mind of that villain and go like, and by doing that and kind of exploring that in itself is an act of empathy, but it's also an act of questioning and exploring, because you literally are having to kind of put yourself in other people's shoes. And I would make the argument like with autobio, you're just having to put yourself in another person's shoes, which is you. But if you're going to do it well, I think you have to do it really objectively. Right. So you have to like step outside of who you are right now and just kind of put yourself in those shoes. So like, to me, that can be kind of a good way to break barriers and stuff. And I think if you're exploring truth, I think truth doesn't change. So I think that's why, you know, like The Great Gatsby is a good example of a book that just doesn't seem to die, even though there are things about it that at the time are very relevant to that time era that would be a little hard for people to understand. The themes haven't changed and probably won't change because it's dealing with true things at the time. And I think that those truths, like, that's kind of what makes art sort of, you know, I don't know. That's my own thing. So I just kind of, you know, I think that if you're exploring truth, I think you'll be okay. I think if you're not exploring truth, then you might end up in that area where you're writing to a camp.
Right.
And
it's the idea of abstraction, I think. Because if at any point, because what you're talking about is you've abstracted yourself in that comic, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're not writing yourself as you would like to be perceived. You're trying to remove yourself and objectify yourself and write yourself from an abstracted point, from an observational standpoint,
Yeah.
to try to achieve more realism, but it's still an abstraction. And anytime, and I think this is really important because I was reading a comic the other day, really enjoying it, and then out of the blue, the character began monologuing this long diatribe about a political philosophy that I didn't even disagree with. Like, I agreed with a lot of what the character was saying, but it was so boring and it was so unlike any real person that I was like, just show me in the story this thing that you're trying to say. I mean, it was literally like an aside. It was really weird. And I just stopped reading it because it took me so far out of the story. It was just bad. But, like, I like this idea of what everybody's talking about in the chat of, instead of saying, you know, I am the creator, thus I am right, this is what you should believe. I like the idea that art has of, like, hey, I'm going to depict this situation that raises some questions that maybe you didn't think about before, right?
Yeah.
Because if you look at that, any major change that has happened in society has happened because of art. Art and music have caused, or at least been, a catalyst for every major social and cultural revolution since the beginning of time, and it's always tied into that, because without somebody coming out and saying, look at this abstraction, and then you draw questions from that you might not have thought of before, then you just continue on as the status quo, as everything is. Like you said with that biography, here is a slave. At that point in time, it was very normal to think that people with darker colored skin aren't even the same species as me. They're a different species as I am because I have this color skin and they have that color skin. And even like Thomas Jefferson tried to categorize them differently in his scientific research. He's got in his journals where he's writing about the physiological differences by way of saying that they're a slightly different type of human being. And until somebody comes along and says, well, what about this guy that isn't like what you think? And it's a book. It's a piece of literature, right? And then on and on and on and on and on. You have like Tom Sawyer and stuff like that, and all of that stuff. And so I love the idea of presenting questions, because questions, here's the thing, a man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still, right? If you just preach at me, I'm just going to be like, shut up, grandpa, or whatever. Like, I don't want to listen to your intellectual attack. But if you raise some questions and then I hadn't thought about those points and I come to a conclusion on my own, it might be a completely different conclusion that you wanted me to come to, but it would be a conclusion that I had not even thought of before. By definition, that will change who I am. And each one of those little changes ends up changing the entire society.
I think that's dead on, and I think that I think that there's this beautiful thing with ambiguity that can kind of lead to asking the right questions, that can kind of lead to developing like your own character, you know. So it like as a human being, just growing in your own character. And so I think there's some things that even art leaves like ambiguous, but it just kind of leaves that question, that nagging question. And I think that kind of touches on something super important, whatever it is, whatever your philosophy, you know. I think there are these things. There's this great thing that happens with art that is unique to art, and I think it's when you witness something that's like touching on truth, that's just like achingly true in a weird way, or if you touch on beauty, which I think ties into truth. But you know, if you make like if you experience beauty, it can almost create this like just gut reaction of like loss. It's a weird feeling when you experience like true beauty, you know. And I've had it happen like in the movie theaters before, when I've seen something just achingly beautiful, or you know, I've had it on vacations, like standing by the Grand Canyon. I don't think most people miss that feeling, like when you're looking over this like vast landscape, and there's just something about it that just it pricks this like part of your consciousness that I don't think many things can do. I think like music can do it. I think visual art can do it, and I think some things in nature can do it. But anyhow, so that kind of thing to me is like what we're kind of aiming to do as artists. We're trying to make something beautiful, or we're trying to make something true, or we're trying to make something terrifying.
Right.
You know, like, but we're trying to do something. And I think in the act of trying, we occasionally succeed at it. And you're right. Like, I think that kind of connection from the art to the consumer, or the person like checking it out or listening, can really have a pretty genuine impact on and eventually shape culture. And it can be, you know, from the lowest of the low art to the highest of the high that has that kind of impact.
Yeah.
I mean, like, you know, you and I are people who like, we are madly in love with cartoonists, and, you know, 90% of the people that we like revere, if you talk to the general public, even though like superheroes are all over the place, like would have no idea who we're talking about.
Right.
And even us, like a lot of those guys, like we probably wouldn't even recognize if we saw walking down the street, you know, but they've had that impact on us with comics, which is like, you know, pretty low art, like, which by the way, I say that as a compliment, because I think we should embrace it. We are making low art, you know, when we make comics and anime.
Well, I think the whole,
awesome.
That's a whole another discussion, but high and low art is this class system that I have a huge problem with.
Oh, I kind of, that's the thing. That's why we'll get into it, but there's a reason I embrace the low, because I kind of think the high is BS, but
agree.
Anyway, we'll get in that.
But yeah, so it's interesting. Just fascinating stuff in the chat. I want to end with something that Holly said that I think is really important too, that we haven't touched on yet. Where did she say it? Fiction can also show you cultures in a weird way. I remember being super interested in Egypt as a kid because of Yu-Gi-Oh! And that's another thing that fiction can do, is like, as a kid growing up in California, I would have never come across Egypt. You know, like in the part of California that I lived in, I didn't know any Egyptians. My next door neighbor is an Egyptian now, but I'm 38 now. But as a kid, you know, I see this cool cartoon, and maybe I start reading about Egypt, and then all of a sudden I'm opened up to this entire culture, this entire set of ideas that's totally different and foreign to the way that I've been raised. And there's that clash, there's that conflict. And it's fascinating to do that. And that's a TV show about, you know, like a card game came to life, kind of Magic the Gathering with monsters and, you know, whatever. And it's like super stylized, and everybody's, none of that has any realism at all, right? But here we have an example, and that's happened to me a number of times. I mean, how many kids have gotten interested in science because of Peter Parker is a nerdy science kid, you know, or how many kids have gotten interested in whatever because somebody that they identify with the way that they feel happens to do that thing or say that thing or like that thing or whatever. It's just, I just think fiction is such an important part of our culture. I don't know.
Yeah, I agree. And I guess like just to kind of wrap this and kind of tie it into our general beginning theme, it's like I think just as an artist navigating the whole polarized landscape, I mean, one aim I would say is like try not to polarize yourself, like try not to be polarizing,
right? Unless
it's worth it, you know? There are some instances where maybe it's worth it. Maybe you've considered the other side. Maybe it's an evil versus good kind of thing.
Sure.
You know, there's some guys that I really disagree with politically, but man, they make great comics. Like a lot of indie cartoonists, actually. make some really powerful comics that are just go on crazy political rants that I would completely disavow, but it makes for extremely entertaining and interesting reading. So to me, I feel like, like to navigate the polarizing landscape as an artist, don't play it too safe, because that's for corporate, like if you're in a corporate environment, play it safe. But like if you're an artist and you're trying to make art, you're trying to make something that makes an impact of some sort, you really have to stay true to what is true and what is horrific and what is beautiful. And that might mean just kind of like making your villains more compelling. And also you can be more subtle too. Like if you have some stuff you want to sneak in, get it in there,
Yeah.
But I do think that the place of fear and like censorship, I don't think that's a good place to be as an artist at all.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's important to point out that you can do all of these really important society-changing things with pirates and Vikings and zombies and monsters and magic and science and spaceships and stuff. Like, and at no point in time do you have to have somebody like turn to the camera and say, and now I will tell you all about my political beliefs or whatever, Yeah, it's interesting. So
for sure. And I mean, like, if you want to do that kind of thing, maybe you should be writing a political book or be a political commentator.
Yeah.
In those cases, that's good too.
If there's a reason in the story for that,
yeah,
and it flows well, because there are people that I know that are like that.
Camera.
They're just waiting to shove their ideas into any conversation. If you've got a character like that in your story, then, I mean, Shakespeare did that. This cracks me up, right? Most of the advice that people quote from Shakespeare is from Polonius in Hamlet, who was a giant windbag and had no idea what he was talking about, including to thine own self be true and, all of this stuff. His kid was running out the door like, Dad, I'm out. I'm going to college. And he's like just shouting all of these things after him that in today's society we've taken and we're like, this is really good advice. And it may be really good advice, but like, consider the source. Shakespeare was making fun of you right there. Like, if you're quoting that to people to try to teach them stuff, like, you're mocking yourself because you don't understand the origin of what's going on.
Yeah,
that guy was a joke.
Quoting a guy who was being teased and written as a character who only spoke in tropes.
Yeah, exactly.
So you're speaking in tropes, quoting a character that was being made fun of and eventually died because of his tropes.
Right. Exactly.
So yeah, hang in there with those. Yeah, cautious with those quotes. All right, so I think this was a fun one, man. I mean, I know we went all over, but I like going all over the place in conversations with you. It's fun, actually.
Yeah. No, I don't know. I just need to get that out there because I felt I have made a choice about 15 years ago. I decided that I would never do anything to manipulate another person or try to coerce them or have them operate out of fear. That fear and coercion were not going to be motivating factors in the way that I operate with other people and in the way that I operate with myself. And yet I've noticed self-censure and hesitation based on fear of some result that I can't control. And so that was really helpful to like talk through a lot of that.
No, so, I agree, and I would definitely say, like, even tying this back into the comic thing that I was talking about too. When I was approaching writing my story, like, there've been a lot of things that I've written that I'm super uncomfortable with. Like, I'm not even comfortable talking about. And I had to make a conscious decision. Like, I had these moments where I was like, well, that's not going to look so good, and I had to just kind of dip in and be a little more balls out about it because it was true to the story and it was true to the goal that I have with the book. There are things that, like, I'll get political on Facebook and on YouTube, and like, if you guys ever get bored, you can look up the No Saboteurs text video that I did. It was like a typographic video, and that'll show you some of my politics. You know, I'm pretty balls out about that. So,
yeah.
But at the same time, like, I'm never going to make the assumption, if I meet somebody who disagrees with me politically, like the instant assumption that they're not as informed or as thought out or have as much, like, I try to hesitate to make any assumptions about other people.
Right.
You know, unless they're being a dick. And then if you're being a jerk to other people, then, like, you know, that's a whole different topic as well. Right. But yeah, like if you're, yeah, I mean, there's, yeah. All right. Yeah. So should we wrap it?
Let's wrap it. Anybody? Yeah. Thanks for coming into the chat. That was awesome.
Yeah.
If you want to check out Josh's stuff, and I would highly recommend it, especially if you haven't yet, and if any part of this conversation was at least in the slightest interesting, go read that. Right? He's got 60-something pages out of it, and it is. I'd just be super interested in your opinion of it, because my opinion is really high of it. So go to quarterlystories.com. And then you can find my stuff at corykerr.com. I will be giving away a big pack of almost 40 different stickers and prints and whatever. So stay tuned on my YouTube channel and Instagram, where I'll be announcing that. And yeah, so that'll be awesome. And then special thanks to No Saboteurs, who have lyrics that will tell you Josh's political leanings, for giving us the intro music. And you can check out their stuff at facebook.com/No Saboteurs. Okay, we'll catch you guys in a couple days.
Bye.